أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Salamun alaikum everybody and welcome to another episode of the Poets of the Household podcast. It's been a long time. I know sometimes dunya gets the best of us and sometimes we get busy, but inshallah, we will make this more frequent and make this more consistent, inshallah. As you know, every episode, the purpose of this episode and this podcast in general is to discuss poetry in light of the praise of our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his holy household alayhimus salam. And every episode, as usual, I'm joined by my guest, my host. Sorry, not my guest. I apologize. That's insulting to my co-host. I apologize to that. I'm getting ahead of myself, guys. Please just bear with me. It's been a minute. So I have my co-host here, brother Naqi Rizvi. Naqi, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. I'd be honored to be a guest one day, but yeah, for now I'm the co-host. But I'm doing
Okay.
good, alhamdulillah. It's snowing here. It's the peak of winter in Toronto, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Inshallah, inshallah. And as of this recording, it is the 3rd of Sha'aban currently. So I'd like to congratulate all of you, give my Mubarak to all of you on this auspicious occasion of the wiladat of our third Imam, Imam Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam, and overall Mubarak to all of you on the month of Sha'aban. With that said, we are very, very honored and privileged to have our guest with us today, Sister Sasa Aakil. She is a world-renowned poet, and we will know more about her. And she is founder of Remembrance in Verse. Sister Sasa, assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Walaikum salam. It's great to be with you. I'm excited to be here and speak with you about all things poetic, and remembrance in verse and anything creative. So I'm really glad to be here.
Inshallah, inshallah. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule for being with us today. And we will talk more about Remembrance in Verse and Poets of the Household and how we are together, inshallah. So as always, Sister Sasa, we always begin our questions, our conversation to understand the journey of our poets. Why did they decide to do poetry and recite poetry and write poetry in praise of our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his holy household? So if you can kind of let our viewers know, let us know what your poetic journey was and why did you decide to write poetry in their
Yeah,
praise?
of course. My poetic journey, I think, I don't think it's particularly long because I'm not particularly old. But I think it's kind of twisty. It's kind of roundabout. So I was homeschooled for my entire childhood. And my mom, my amazing mother, Latifa Barnett, taught me about poetry randomly, one day, and she took me through a lesson. And I had always loved words and I had always loved writing. And so I really took to poetry when she taught me about it, on that random winter in, I don't know, 2011, something like that.
Wow,
Um,
mashallah.
and I really took to the medium and I enjoyed it. And so, that school year was over and I continued writing. And then she took me through another poetry unit because she realized that I had liked it. And so I was around 9 or 10 years old at this stage, and I realized that I really enjoyed poetry. And so as a kid, I was very, very sensitive. I still am a sensitive person, and I had all of these feelings inside me all the time. And so what I found was that the page was a release. It was one of the ways that I could really walk myself through my feelings and understand what was
Yeah,
going on in my world. And so through that, I think naturally, as just a regular Muslim kid, I was also writing about Allah and God and family and love and that kind of thing. Until eventually I hit around like 12 or 13, and me and my mom started looking for programs where I could further develop my poetic skill, because I just still liked it and I wanted to do more of it. And we hit on a few local programs, some in DC, some in Maryland, and that kind of I took off from there. I joined an organization based in DC and started writing a lot, and mostly in secular spaces. So I wasn't writing as much about the Prophet and his family. I wasn't writing about AhlulBayt. I wasn't writing about Allah as much, but I was still in my own time kind of learning and applying my skill to these subject matters that we as Shia Muslims care about. And
right.
so these two skill sets kind of developed in tandem, although they were in separate places. So as I continued to write in these secular spaces and compete as a poet and eventually start performing for money, which was cool as a kid to be able to do,
Wow.
I was also coming back into the community and applying my skills to, again, writing about the AhlulBayt, writing about the Prophet, writing about his family. Um, and so it was a kind of like step-by-step experience, learning how to do both of those things until about 2020. Yeah, I think where I began kind of writing more in Muslim spaces. Um, and kind of using my voice and applying it more intentionally to talking about the Ahlul Bayt and Karbala specifically. Um, and throughout this entire period, I was also helping my brother who performs elegies often. And so I was helping him write his own elegies. I was writing some with him, I was writing some on my own and giving them to him. And so this process kind of, again, was developing as I continued to write. And so now I have been a professional poet for about 4 years, where I've been actually writing and teaching workshops and performing in places, in different spaces professionally.
Wow.
Um, and at the same time, I've found this space in the Shia community where I think there's very much a need for English poetry
Yeah.
that I've, you know, alhamdulillah, through I think just a random turn of events, been able to fill.
Mm.
And so I've been able to travel to communities like Sacred Roots in Chicago and share my poetry there. And that's kind of lands us here.
Wow. Wow. So you do this on a full-time basis?
I am a full-time poet and artist. So I do, right now I'm in my studio, I make things, and then I also perform poetry and teach and all
MashaAllah.
kinds of stuff. Yeah.
That's the dream. The dream is always, if you would do this for free, would you do this for free? And the answer, if the answer is yes, then that means you're living your dream job.
Yeah.
So kudos to you, mashallah. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I think I saw you even have like a intersection of your ceramic art and like making letters from each one of your pieces, and that was kind of
Yeah,
cool. I'd love to get to know about that a little bit more later too, if you have time.
of course.
Um, but I guess like following from your from you explained to us how your journey has been. You first focused on sharpening your skills, where you were in the secular spaces, and now you're coming in into the Shia spaces and seeing what could be better here, what is needed here, what's required here. And I think that's something that we've been discussing a lot on this podcast, but generally within Poets of the Household, is where do we naturally progress in terms of commemoration for Imam Hussein, the elegies that we write, Azadari that we call within our communities. A lot of times, especially for like an example of me and Abbas, we are looking at it from the insider's point of view, where we already have a lot of this lineage of like a culture that we're bringing in with us here, and sometimes it's hard to escape that. And then looking at it from fresh eyes is even more difficult because you don't know how to diverse yourself from things that you're bringing in to things how it might be or should be. And it seems like this is something that you are trying to explore in Remembrance in Verse, and I'd like you to go into a little bit more about what Remembrance in Verse is. What was the idea behind it? Why did you think that there's a need to start this? And yeah, feel free to walk us through this a little bit.
Yeah, so Remembrance in Verse is right now it's a online database and resource of English language lamentation and remembrance, which is the term that we are using for Azadari, meaning poetry and elegies, what people would call English nohas, as a reference point for artists who are trying to be in this space. We aim to define the genre of English language lamentation and remembrance, and we also aim to be a support for people who want to elevate their work in this space. So that's like in a nutshell what Remembrance in Verse is. We're very new, but this project came about, or this initiative came about because last year in 2023 in July, my brother and I traveled to Chicago to the Sacred Roots community during Muharram to perform poetry and elegies, which had been doing for the past 3 years in that community, which has been an amazing experience. Shout out to Sheikh Trent for making that possible. And we performed a poem. I call it a poem. I'm not sure what other people would consider it. But we performed a poem that included lines from Wade in the Water, which is a Negro spiritual that has been, circulating in this country since 400 years ago.
Mm.
And that Wade in the Water was incorporated into this poem about Hadra Abbas. And so It went viral online. Um,
It was a beautiful piece. I mean, we've heard Wade in the Water. Personally, I have. I mean, the context, we understand the historical context behind it, and it was a way for during the time of course, of slavery, and so and for you to use that in a way and tie that in with Karbala, I mean, it attracted so many hearts so fast. I'm sorry, I know you're explaining. I just want to know why. I want to give you my personal feeling when I heard it. I heard it, my family heard it, and I mean, because we're very enriched in history, not just Islamic history, but like U.S. modern history, things of that nature, and we know why Wade in the Water was used and what it was used for, and for you to kind of transform that into Karbala was just was amazing. And yeah, if you can kind of give a little bit more details. I know you're talking about Remembrance in Verse
yeah.
and your journey, but how you and your brother kind of decided to use this for Karbala. I want to know every bit of detail, so please don't hold back.
Okay. Okay. So we performed this piece called Wade in the Water. I'm sorry, this piece was actually called River Tears. But it includes the lines from Wade in the Water. And so that went viral. And um about that piece itself. So it was something that I had written because I had this idea for years, like for 2 years, I had the idea of like, okay, what if we combine Negro spirituals with like a poem about the AhlulBayt, Karbala, like all those events. And this was in my mind because people often think that there is no worship tradition in the US that is similar to worship traditions that we have in other like Shia majority or historically Shia countries. And that's not the case. We do have worship traditions. They're just very niche and typically about Christianity. But as a Black American Muslim, many of those songs that apply or that we grew up with that are part of our history also apply to our daily life. And so for me, it was very, very, very easy for me to see the connections between how important water is in the context of like African American history and water when we think about being transported across the ocean during the transatlantic slave trade, water when we think about the very important real fear that people have had of being sold down the river, aka sold away from their families, and water when we think about it being used as a medium to escape to freedom.
Wow.
And then when we think about water as Shia Muslims, we're thinking about water as what Imam Hussein and his families were kept from, what was taken from them, what they were blocked away from. Water in the context of making wudu and how we think of it as something that can renew us and something that can wash away our sins, and water in the sense of fasting and depriving ourselves from water intentionally. And so I was like, these things, like they talk, they're in conversation. And to me, it was very clear that they were in conversation, especially when we talk about this idea of how my ancestors were so often searching for freedom and
Yeah.
running toward freedom, and what that looks like in an Islamic sense. What is freedom Islamically? And we know that it's not necessarily freedom from bondage. We know that it's freedom from our own nafs. We know that it's freedom to worship Allah. And we know that it's freedom to go join Allah in heaven. And so all of these things were working in my mind. And so I pulled out that specific Negro spiritual because I think it's a popular one and it was just on my mind and in my heart and related to water. And then I wrote the poem and I wasn't sure it was going to work. Like I really was like, I'm not sure this is a good idea. But then I sat down with my brother and I was like, okay, we have to try this and we have to do it. Um, and then he filled in the vocals for me and we did it together once. And he was like, oh yeah, this works. And I was like, yes, it
It's
works.
always a good feeling as an artist, as a person who creates, that when something hits and something you know that you know what this is gonna work, it's just a
Yeah.
feeling that's indescribable.
Exactly. And so that was the moment and having him there to kind of like as a creative sounding board to just be like, oh yes, this is actually working. And so that was how that came about. And as I said, yeah, we performed it at Sacred Roots and it went viral. And it's really funny because that wasn't expected. I actually expected a lot more pushback from the Shia community, but it was embraced so wholeheartedly by so many people. And what I realized in that moment, getting back to Remembrance in Verse, is that there was a need. People were responding to a very real need that was being filled by having this poem in English that spoke to the history of the places they were in, but then also spoke to our very treasured history as Shia Muslims. Um, and so immediately while we were still in Chicago, the day after, maybe 2 days after, I was like, Sheikh Trent, okay, we have this moment. What does this mean? What are we going to do with this? Um, and he had some ideas and I had some ideas, and I sat on it for like 4 months or something, like did nothing. And then finally went back to him and started kind of bouncing ideas back and forth and getting some of his guidance on what an English language community could look like, specifically surrounding our arts, our expression, about Karbala, Muharram, AhlulBayt, etc. And so that's how we landed on Remembrance in Verse, which, again, as I said before, the goal of which is to provide this database of this English language. We're aiming to define this genre of lamentation and remembrance. We're aiming to amplify these artists who are already a part of this genre, because this is not something that's new. It's not something that I'm inventing or that anyone is inventing. And then we're aiming to educate people about what this genre can look like, how it can grow beyond what our notions think it has to be, and then how we can elevate it, how we can move it from where it is to where it can be, and perhaps where it should be. We know that art forms are constantly evolving as cultures evolve. And so one of the goals of Remembrance in Verse is really to be a part of that evolution and kind of help move us along to the next step. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense because that actually ties into the next question I wanted to ask is that the current state where we are right now, like, what kind of mistakes did you see that were happening? Did you see avoid? I mean, you did touch a little bit on that, but sometimes we always have a starting point where we see that what this is a gap that we see. This is sometimes a starting point. So, in regards to the current state of English poetry and what's lacking, can you kind of let us know your opinion on what kind of you think mistakes are being made? Maybe that's not the correct term, but any gaps or anything that we're lacking right now.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're in a place, I think, cresting a hill. I think we're cresting our mountain, and once we get to the top, we'll have this beautiful view.
Mhm.
I think the work of people like Ali Fadl and Voices of Passion and groups and artists like them have really moved us to this place where people recognize that lamentation and remembrance is a thing, that English language lamentation and remembrance is a thing, and that it should be. But we're still not at a point where it's widely accepted or it's popularized in many communities. My brother had the unfortunate experience of he went to recite elegies at a community that was primarily Urdu speaking, and people were interrupting him and talking over him and ignoring him. So we know that it's not accepted in every space. So it's a thing. And it's been made a thing by some really important movers, and we really value and appreciate their work. But it's not as widely accepted as it should be. But I think at the same time, we have this I think many English speaking Shias have this like hole in our hearts where we wish we could connect more with the work that exists, and not just people like me whose only language has ever been English because we're from the US, but also people who are second and third generation immigrants. They don't connect with the work as much as they would like to, and so there's this need in our communities for something more than what has been. And so that's what I heard a lot when me and my brother went to perform in different places. People would say, "Oh, I've never heard anything like that," or "Oh, I've never heard an elegy this good in English. Wow." You know?
Yeah.
And so we have this need that our community has. And I think now with organizations like Poets of the Household and Remembrance in Verse, inshallah, I think that will bring us to this next stage of really defining, creating beautiful, new, inventive work in this genre, and also really filling that deep, I think, um, it's just a very true, genuine need that people have to recognize themselves in the media that they're consuming. And so I think we're about to hit our renaissance. We just need to just get there.
Right.
I think some of the difficulties we're having now is one, lack of acceptance. And then I also think an over-reliance on what I like to call the host language. So what that means to me is that a lot of people, when they're writing in English, what they're doing is they're translating from another language, or they are relying on the linguistic, poetic kind of norms and forms of that other language. And often when those things are brought over into English, they don't quite work. And so I think a lot of our artists right now are dealing with trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. because it's just not entirely working. And so I think once we can get to this
By the way,
space
that
of
was a sorry, that was a really good metaphor, by the way. Very poetic.
thank you. Um, I think once we get to a point of educating people on how to use the English language to the best of its ability, I think that will really, really be when this genre starts to flourish.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Two things before Naki move on to your question. I want to share my thoughts about Wade in the Water, and what I thought was very good was that I know why those kind of those folk songs, I guess, Wade in the Water, things what that was used for as kind of a mode of communication, so that freedom can happen. Because I know there were a lot of oppression was happening during that time, and so the communications, the modes of communication, talking freely was just not allowed. And so they use Wade in the Water to use that as a method to communicate so that slavery can end in a way. Similarly, I mean, the way that I saw it was that when after Karbala, when Imam Zain al-Abidin and Bibi Zainab were imprisoned, they didn't let Imam Sajjad speak. They didn't let him talk. They didn't let him communicate. So what he did was that to get the message out, he used dua.
Mhm.
He used his du'as to get the message across, and that caused the revolution inside, and that caused people to awaken, and they became free. And so that's why we have Saif Sajadia currently right now in that form. So, that method of communication where, because you can't stop dua, you can't stop someone from giving dua. So Imam Zain al-Abidin, I mean, we know how amazingly smart the imams were, using that as a method to become free. Similarly with Wade in the Water as well. So that's the kind of the connection that I saw that you heard with. I just wanted to share that one thought. And secondly, in regards to what you're talking about is, cultural norms and not being accepted. I mean, Brother Naqi and I come from a Pakistani background. Like we started off in Urdu. My journey was really listening to Urdu poetry, reciting Urdu poetry, and then finding that niche, finding that kind of like you said, the hole, the gap that's there for English poetry. So uh, us being Pakistani and doing that, people are like, why? Why don't you just go into Urdu? Oh, well, I'm like, first of all, we have this need of being poets as well. And sometimes when you know how to speak a certain language, that doesn't mean that you can do poetry in that language, right? Poetry in itself, it's its own language. So, because I mean, speaking for myself, we have more control over the English language. We can express ourselves better. So that journey that you're going through, where similarly, us being Pakistani, us being Urdu speaking, it's there. And alhamdulillah, I think like Poets of the Household, Remembrance in Verse, like you said, barriers are being broken. And people are like, oh, this is actually not bad. Because what happens is that we start comparing languages, where each language has its own beauty. Like Urdu, if you compare it to Arabic, Arabic is the most probably the richest language that we know, but Urdu has its own beauty, like that we can speak of. English too, if you compare it to Urdu, yeah, it might not resonate well, but English does have its own beauty. And things like Wade in the Water and pieces that people give when we have our prompts and these English suggestions that we have and these poetry slams that we have, people realize, no, your heart can't be touched. So kind of the similar journey that you're going through is what we're going through as well.
Exactly. And I think that's part of why Remembrance in Verse is so necessary right now, because we're all going through the same things, even from all these different backgrounds.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
let's get together and make something happen, you know?
Exactly. For
Yeah,
sure.
and I want to go deeper into that a little bit before I move on to the next question. We've been discussing this in like a previous podcast as well, and generally this has been a discussion of like what is the example that we have right now when we're starting this tradition of English poetry for the AhlulBayt, for example, right? And a lot of times we try to make the comparison because we come from an Urdu background that 600 years ago when the Urdu language was developing and, there was Muslims moving into South Asia and then, they had to create this new culture, this new language, these new terminologies. And we always try to think about that and how they made this whole tradition very, very close to the Indian subcontinent culture, where you might think that the event of Karbala happened within the Indian subcontinent. That's how culturally immersed that poetry is. Whereas even the English tradition is way way older than 500-600 years ago, and like you mentioned, like worship traditions even in North America are several hundred years ago, pretty much maybe matching the same time frame. Where do you see, like practically speaking, like where can we start to and like this is where maybe getting into your head in Remembrance in Verse, how do you start thinking about how do we define these terminologies? What is a reference point for these things? Are we looking at X tradition, Y tradition? Are we creating something brand new? So I guess I want to walk through your head, right? As someone who's pioneering and trailblazing a lot of this, laying the foundations out for what things should be, right? Or what things could look like. How do you do that?
Yeah, truly, I think it's for everyone to decide for themselves. I think that's part of the beautiful thing about being an artist, and I think part of the beautiful thing about um being of being Muslim, being Shia, being of this community that's so multicultural, that we all get to shape our expressions for ourselves. And so for me, I believe that nothing is new, especially not art. Like everything that's been made has been made before. And so it's very much for me a practice of, as you can tell with the River Tears piece, it's a practice of pulling from these traditions that already exist and really making my own. And I think in that way it is new, because I'm combining things. But nothing is truly new, I would say. And so back in 2022, I heard an elegy that someone performed that was literally a ballad. And I'm trying to find this person and try to find a recording because I want to share it. But it was a ballad, as in the old like English
Yeah.
form with a quatrain and A B rhyme scheme, like a ballad. And I
Yeah.
was listening to it and I was like, oh, this is a ballad, with my poet ear. I was like, wait, this is wild. I never would have thought to perform a ballad about Imam Hussein. Like, you know
Yeah.
and so I think when we are talking about how what we're making, what is being made in the moment, I think it's for these artists to take these reference points and really bring them together to create whatever I think they would like to express. And of course,
Mm.
Islamically, we have some boundaries. We know what we can do, we know what we can't. But as long as we're operating within those boundaries, I think we have limitless potential to create whatever we want. And the work is not to say this is good and this is bad. The work is to say it can be what we want it to be. And so that's why I think the fact that it's English language makes it broad anyway, because English is spoken across a variety of
Mm.
minutes. And I really think we make what we have, and we'll be united by our theme and our subject
Mm.
matter. And we'll be united by our desire to move closer to Allah by worshiping, by praising, astaghfirullah, not worshiping, by praising the people who He loved.
Yeah, no, that makes
Yeah.
sense. And I guess another point I want to add there is like you mentioned, I think a lot of it might come down to just making sure we're masters of the craft. And
Yeah.
maybe the mistake isn't bringing or pulling from other traditions, like the Eastern traditions, for example. Maybe the mistake is how we're doing that too, right? For example, when I read Agha Shahid Ali, I'm not sure if you read much of his work, but he does a really good job at making things seem very natively English, but all the subject matter that he talks about is, related to his homeland, conflicts in Kashmir, for example, where his background is from, or even the some poetry that he's written for the AhlulBayt. It seems so natural to the English language, and he's kind of managed to do that very well because he is, at first, an English poet, right, and then he writes about these subjects, right? So he's coming to them already with a skill set that is developed. So maybe I think one thing that might be useful for the listeners also is to not get discouraged from not pulling at some of these lineages that we have, right? But doing it in a way where it's effective and it works and it makes sense to the host language.
Exactly. And if I can just say, because I'm a poetry nerd, like I really love the nitty-gritty and the boring parts of poetry that other people hate. I really love. But I do think it's like what you said, focusing on the craft of the poetry and the writing. We need to know how poetry is written in English on any topic. We need to read poetry by anyone. And we need to very much apply our subject matter to the English language while still making sure that it makes sense. I had this experience with my brother, who his name is Hussein, by the way. I haven't mentioned that before. A lot of people know him, but I had this experience where he speaks Arabic and Farsi. So he gave me a Noha in Farsi, and he wanted me to use the melody to write a Noha in English. And there was a part where in Farsi it had like maybe 20 syllables by, my counting. I don't know how syllables are counted in Farsi, but by my count, it was around 20 syllables. And I was writing it, and then I gave it back to him, and he was like, no, this isn't enough. words. And I was like, no, we can't fit 20 syllables here in English. That doesn't make sense with the way that our language is used and the way that our meter is typically applied. We can only have about 5 to 10 syllables here. Nothing else is going to work. And so I think being able, when we're talking about pulling from our lineage, pulling from whatever cultural tradition we have to be able to make that distinction and say, actually, this is beautiful and this is beautiful, but this part right here, this is not going to work in English. How am I going to apply my own skill as a poet in English to this to make it work? For me personally, I'm very much trained in the Black American poetic tradition, which is a very distinct thing that often is connected to like performance and slam culture and that kind of thing. And so when I'm writing, I'm like, okay, how am I going to write about the AhlulBayt, Muharram, etc., in the context of what I'm trained in, what I know well, and still make sure that it holds water. And sometimes I break rules and sometimes I keep them, but I'm always pulling from my elders, my education that I have in this poetic style. So anyways, I'm a nerd, but just make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head there because what's key is that you kind of have, in order for a culture to grow, in order for something to grow, you have to create fresh content. You have to create fresh pieces. And that's typically what happens is that we'll use a melody from another language and trying to fit English words on there, where the goal and what we should try to do is create fresh compositions, fresh words, fresh poems, and then that's how it grows because. I mean, there have been times when I'll receive a melody, for example, and luckily I know this has happened to you as well, from another poem, like another noha or another, and be like, hey, can you write English on this? And we've tried, we have done that, but it's just sometimes it's like something is being stretched, sometimes it's being reduced, sometimes, and then it just doesn't sound as good, and it's being forced. So what's good is that you need to like the both of you are saying, you need to know the craft first. You need to, especially if you are writing something where the tune needs to be consistent throughout, then you need to know which syllables need to be stressed and which syllables should be unstressed. And then there's a proper weight, a proper rhythm within the lines, and then you create a fresh composition. And that's how that culture grows. Like what I mean, the way that Wade in the Water, River of Tears worked very well was that, your brother sang the piece, and then while he's humming, you did a spoken word. Like that's something that is unique, that's fresh, and that hits home. And that's when people start uh, respecting that culture. They start understanding, saying that, you know what, they have something here. And, the bias that they had that, oh, nothing can happen in English, those kind of go away. And that is on the poetry side, and that is also on the lecture side as well. So, when you have your intention clean, and I'm a strong believer of this, when your intention is clean, the elevate help you out. And that's exactly what the intention that we need to have moving forward. And that's how English poetry will grow as a culture for sure.
I also
Yeah, for
wanted to
sure.
real quick before we move on. I know this is going long. But that point of my brother doing the Wade in the Water, performing it with the melody, and then humming while I did the poem, that's not new, that's not fresh. It's just new and fresh in this context. So I just applied something that had been done a lot in the secular spaces that I was in, and applied it here. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's new in the sense that I meant like we haven't heard it before in English. At least I
Yeah,
haven't.
no,
I
no,
mean,
exactly,
so that's
exactly.
why people are like, oh, this is amazing. So yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess from that very point, I guess I'll move to the next question is connected to that. You use the metaphor of like we're climbing on top of this, mountain, and we're almost at the peak and we might be able to see what the horizon looks like. I guess I want to ask you, as someone who might have some idea of what this could look like, some examples, like for example, you've given us examples of the Black American tradition, right? This could be one example of how this manifests in our communities, for example, in our majalis. What other ways could that you can see that where it could fit in the Western tradition, or it seems natural or native to the Western tradition, where we could have this remembrance, this lamentation, these elegies, where it feels native, I guess.
Hmm.
Other examples, I guess if you could.
Other examples of like application of this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like right
I'm
now, for example, just to get, I guess, like maybe clarify the question. For example, spoken word is very common in our centers, at least in Toronto, and I know in North America, many places, and that obviously has its roots in that African American tradition, from the slam poetry, for example, like you mentioned. We've seen work that you have been doing using those, the worship poetry from the past, for example. What other ways do you think we could maybe apply these elegies and remembrance?
That's actually a super hard question because I think even for me, I'm still doing so much work trying to expand my mind and expand the things. I think one piece that I feel like I shouldn't say this because sometimes I have this feeling that like if I'm still working on something, I shouldn't talk about it. But I'll mention it anyway. One thing that I've tried to do in the past is I'll perform a poem, regular kind of like, spoken word style, reciting the poem out loud. And I've had the audience accompany me with matam the whole time, just hitting their chests with a consistent rhythm. And so for me, what that is, and I haven't said this to anybody, so you guys like this is the first platform I'm saying this out loud.
Exclusive, most of the household exclusive.
For me, that's an application of the cipher, which is another
Mm.
African American tradition. Because what happens in a cipher is that you stand in a circle, everybody makes a beat with their mouths or their body or something, and then someone stands in the middle and raps,
Wow.
which our centers may not be ready for that. But what they are ready for is to sit down in community and think about Imam Hussein while they hit their chests, and I, the poet, put images into their mind. And so that's been one application of like, a tradition from my background that I've thought about. I think another one is I've heard, and this actually came from a Desi brother talking about the similarities between improvisational jazz and the nohas that are performed and recited in primarily Desi communities. And genuinely, like to this day, I don't quite see it. But there's something there. And I may not be the person to make that happen, but there is this potential where these things can marry. Or again, the idea of having a ballad, which are traditionally about sad events, and having a ballad and applying that to the events of Karbala. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's a tough question. I was mostly to pick your mind and see if you have any, visions of where it could go. But no, I think this is something we're gonna see as time progresses and we keep working on this and exploring things, trying new things. I wanted to, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing. Truly, my dream is that we stop limiting ourselves. I think often we're limited by like bias and sometimes just straight racism about what we think is okay, what we think is halal, and what we think can be Islamic. And so I think my dream is that we can remove ourselves from that bias and really apply our cultures to the best of our ability, with the widest breadth. And as long as it's halal, as long as it's about our prophet and his family, and as long as our goal is again to worship Allah, then I think that's my dream.
Yeah,
No,
no,
100%.
absolutely. The break those cultural barriers is always a challenge. That's
Yeah.
the jihad as well, for sure. Absolutely. Naki, anything else before we end off? Anything
No,
else
I think
anything else you want to make her stuck on and make her regret joining our podcast? Chucking.
no, I
No,
think there's one more thing I could make you nervous. Maybe it's gonna make you nervous, but maybe it's not. But
do it.
sharing pieces of your poetry at the end. This is
Yes.
something we try to do at the end of our podcast, where our special guest will perform piece or piece of their poem. So we'd love for you to do that.
Yeah. I'm going to read two poems. One I think very much explains like my thought process with connecting my personal history as a Black American with Shia Islam, and then the second one is just your standard
Mm.
Karbala poem. So,
Bismillah.
to be Black and Shia is to be born into a dual tradition of seeking freedom in God, asking no one for what can only be granted by Allah, the Most High. What I mean is that Harriet used to threaten be free or die, by which she meant to be free or be freer. To be Black and Shia is to easily draw lines between my ancestors by blood and my forefathers by faith. One seeking, one found freedom. To be Black and Shia is to know that freedom lives down the same road as heaven, that heaven lives down the same road as prayer and
Mm,
protest, unrest and standing for a cause, and to know that Hur found it, and Joan found it, and freedom is the ability to worship Allah unhindered. To be Black and Shia is to know that a glass of water is not just a glass of water. It is a connection to our history and the pain we've survived, the trail of Black bodies across the Atlantic and how they mimic the trail of bodies on battlefield leading
mm,
deeper. A history both waterlogged and thirsty, drowned and deprived, dying and yet so alive. To be Black and Shia is to be killed, chained, captive,
wow.
yet free in our worship and in our belief.
Wow.
SubhanAllah.
That was
Wow.
really nice. That was really, really good.
Wow. What a way to tie both. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah.
Thank you. Uh,
Beautiful.
and then this next one, I'm just gonna close out. And this is entitled I Am Land. I saw nothing but bravery, a valor that I have yet to see matched in all my years, and I have known long years. I saw courage. It looked like Ali Akbar and it looked like Asghar. It looked like Hur and Qasim. It looked like Zainab and Sakina. It looked like every life that stood for truth and justice. That day I saw blood fall like rain and was both honored to receive it and pained to see it spilled. But I bore it as best I could. The heavy hoofbeats of horses did not hurt me. But I ached at the impact of Abbas's falling body. I cringe and weep and hope to keep each member of my prophet's family safe and whole until they can join me, become part of my embrace. As long as that may take, the things I saw on that day don't fade. I have not forgotten. I will not forget. I am the land of Karbala. This battle took place on my back, and I saw nothing but bravery, nothing but fortitude, faith, and victory, hard won, hard lost, though it may be. No one bothers mention, but on that day I too was thirsty for something more kind, more quenching than blood, bodies, and shattered blades. Lady Zainab looked across me and saw nothing but beauty
Mm,
even as she searched for her brother's fallen body, and I thank Allah for the honor of being the one to bear my Imam's body, his bones becoming dust, like me, hallowed ground, haunted home, holy. Today they come from all over to know me, to see the place where their Imam's life ceased and where their story began. I am home. I am land.
that was
Wow.
beautiful. Very,
Beautiful.
very beautiful.
Beautiful. Like it's just metaphor after metaphor, mashallah. Similarly, like just it's so many tools to talk about. Like even the first one we talked about waterlogged, the way you utilize that and just and the way that you tied in Karbala with the second piece in regards to what you're looking for and how you tied it in with your desires. That's like I said, this is something that's not commonly done in the English language. And so when people hear that, you know, the acceptance and the respect of that grows for sure.
Inshallah.
With
That's
that said, this brings us to an end to our episode of the Poets of the Household. Sister Sasa, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. Before we close off, any last message or anything that you would like to plug before we end today's episode?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation. I love talking about poetics. And yes, everyone who is watching and listening, please do follow Remembrance in Verse on Instagram. That's remembrance.in.verse. Not reversed like in verse, like in poetry. And we will be posting elegies and poems by amazing English poets in and artists all over that page. So please follow, join in on the journey, tell your friends and family, and please invite an English poet to your local masjid. That would mean something big for a work like ours. So,
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much, Sister Sasa. Again, with that, brothers and sisters, this ends another episode of the Poets of the Household podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today. Until next time, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.